President Cyril Ramaphosa has called on SADC countries to accelerate economic integration and build stronger regional value chains to reduce dependence on imported goods and the exporting of raw materials. Speaking at the SADC summit in Durban, Ramaphosa said that while the region recorded economic growth of about 3.4% in 2025, intra-regional trade remains far too low, accounting for only around 20% of total trade.
While our regional integration agenda is making progress, the pace of transformation remains slow. Our region recorded economic growth of approximately 3.4% in 2025, yet intra-SADC trade accounted for only around 1/5 of the region's total trade. After decades of integration, we have not yet truly and fully unlocked the potential of our regional market. We continue to import too many goods that we could produce within our region. We continue to export, as we heard from our Executive Secretary, raw materials that we could process and beneficiate here ourselves in our region. We continue to procure services from elsewhere that our own people and businesses have the skills and the capacity to provide. Every raw material exported without beneficiation represents value that has left our shores. Every product imported that could competitively be manufactured here represents jobs that could have been created in our communities. We have everything we need across our 16 member states to meet the needs of our people. We have the natural resources, we have the land and agricultural potential, and we do have the skills and capabilities that can produce all the needs of our people. Above all, we have more than 400 million people whose energy, ingenuity, enterprise must become the driving force of our development.
Well, the 46th summit of SADC heads of state and government is underway at the International Convention Center in Durban. That's where President Cyril Ramaphosa was, of course, giving that speech. SABC News anchor Oliver Dixon, there you saw him in your screen, is in Durban, and he joins us now live. Oliver, a very good afternoon to you. So walk us through just how crucial, firstly, the summit is, and just some of the critical points that President Cyril Ramaphosa was addressing in that opening speech this morning, especially around, calling for a greater urgency in implementing SADC's development agenda. In fact, admitting that SADC's transformation has been slow.
Yeah. Well, the president gave two speeches today, and I'm going to take you through some of the highlights and key issues that he touched on in each of those speeches. First, he gave a speech as the interim chair, and then he gave a second, much shorter speech as the incoming chair. Programmatically, the heads of state are currently engaged in the closed session of the program, and this is where they're discussing the issues that are seemingly and one would assume quite sensitive. We will later on in the day at around 5 or 6 o'clock today, depending on how the program runs. We do know that the program started about 2 hours late today. Depending on where the program is at the time, we will receive a press briefing then, which will be addressed by President Cyril Ramaphosa. So we'll get more details about what's come up in the closed sessions and some of the key resolutions coming out of that. But I want to take you back earlier on in the program earlier today, where President Cyril Ramaphosa was handed over the chairpersonship by President Emmerson Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe. And this is what President Ramaphosa had to say when he received the acknowledgement and recognition as the incoming chairperson of the SADC. Take a listen at this.
On behalf of the government and the people of South Africa, I accept the responsibility of assuming the chairpersonship of the Southern African Development Community. We do so with profound humility, a deep sense of duty, and an unwavering commitment to the peoples of Southern Africa.
Well, typically when a president comes in as the chairperson of SADC or many other multilateral bodies like the African Union as an example, or perhaps even other multilateral bodies like the G20 or the G7, they would have to, of course, define what their agenda will be for the year of their chairpersonship and what the issues are that they will begin to champion. However, this is an extraordinary circumstance under which President Cyril Ramaphosa is coming in. He's coming in not as a chairperson anew. This is also the fourth time in the existence of SADC that South Africa has been able to take over as the chairperson of the organization. And this time around, of course, circumstances are vastly different. Now, we already have a sense of what some of the big issues are top of mind for President Cyril Ramaphosa. And I want to take you through some of them, and I do want to unpack them as we go through a number of these issues. One of the biggest issues has been that of the economy. And very specifically with a focus on where the GDP of the region stands, but more specifically what our muscle might be. I want you to take a listen to what President Ramaphosa said earlier on today about the economic positioning of where the SADC member states find themselves right now. Have a listen at this.
Today, our task is to give economic and social meaning to that political liberation. We are a community of 16 nations and more than 430 million people, with a GDP that is edging towards $1 trillion shortly.
Now, as we've learned with the COVID-19 pandemic, disease preparedness and disease readiness is inextricably tied to economic well-being and vice versa. That is to say, your economy can only do well if you are able to take control of pandemics and the like. And that, of course, is a big issue in SADC. Now, of course, the DRC finds itself in a very peculiar situation. And the president touched on the Ebola outbreak in the DRC. I want you to have a listen at what he said about that.
Through the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the World Health Organization, we are strengthening disease surveillance, pandemic preparedness, and health security across our region. The importance of this cooperation is demonstrated by the devastating Ebola outbreak caused by the Ebola virus in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. At the latest count, nearly 5,000 confirmed cases have been recorded and more than 2,300 lives have been lost.
Now, I guess it is worth mentioning that the DRC is not represented here by the head of state, that is President Felix Tshisekedi. Importantly, this gathering has to find some sort of answer in the region to not just things like the Ebola outbreak, but how to manage other similar kinds of diseases. I want to bring into the conversation now SABC specialist correspondent Sophie Mokoena to help us just comb through some of what we've heard in those clips by President Cyril Ramaphosa. Sophie, the economic conversation is a big one, right? And very specifically because the economic conversation ties itself to some of the goals that they hope to achieve here, not just on regional integration, but making sure that they're able to find themselves on the question of the authorization of the Africa Free Trade area, but also very importantly on things like critical minerals and industrialization. Did President Ramaphosa go into enough depth in that speech, in that clip that we played, surrounding that question coming out of the 46th meeting of this?
I think these are the issues behind the scenes where they will have enough time to talk about what needs to be done, the time frames, and the way to ensure that this is implemented, because we know that if you don't address the challenges of the economy in the region, you are not going to see the development that you want. And as you heard, when the SADC was launched, it was more of a solidarity movement. But now it is an organization or perhaps a community that is trying to change the lives of the citizens of their respective countries. And therefore, you have to find a way to grow the economy and to ensure that that growth does trickle down into addressing the issue of poverty and unemployment. So I think in the closed session right now, these are the issues that they are going to grapple with. When the president is addressing during his closing remarks, I expect him to be more broad in terms of where to from here. That's where we'll get better clarity. But secondly, the media briefing, I think the Secretary of SADC will share some information, will be able to respond to questions.
Yeah. Well, regional integration, Sophie, was a big issue, and I want to take your attention to what President Cyril Ramaphosa had to say about regional integration, because I think that's not just something that came up in his speech. It also came up quite strongly in that of the Executive Secretary, Elias Mukhosi of Botswana. Have a listen at what President Ramaphosa had to say about regional integration.
While our regional integration agenda is making progress, the pace of transformation remains slow. Our region recorded economic growth of approximately 3.4% in 2025, yet intra-SADC trade accounted for only around 1/5 of the region's total trade. After decades of integration, we have not yet truly and fully unlocked the potential of our regional market.
Well, the regional integration conversation is itself not without controversy, right? Because that's a conversation about where we stand on the immigration question, on the border question, but also on what the full optimization of the Africa continental free trade area looks like. Those are all things we would expect that will be touched on in the closed session. But I want to bring into the conversation now the spokesperson to President Cyril Ramaphosa, Vincent Magwenya. Vincent, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here. Really appreciate it.
Good afternoon to you, and good afternoon to Sophie and the viewers.
Yeah, right now the president, of course, will have to win over his agenda in that closed session, one would imagine, as he takes over the chairpersonship here. What's top of mind for the president?
Well, right now as we speak, a series of decisions are being discussed and adopted. About 5 decisions have already been adopted. The discussion is underway now on food security, as well as commitments that the sub-regions needs to make with respect to addressing food insecurity in the region. We have more decisions still to be discussed across areas such as peace and security, what to do with critical minerals, the issue of industrialization that you were discussing as a key element of regional integration. And so the leaders are now grappling with the bolts and nuts, if you like, of the issues that are confronting SADC, as well as the opportunities that SADC needs to pursue for the goal of economic advancement, development, and the stability that we would like to see in the region.
Yeah, one would imagine that the conversation specifically around food security and insecurity is a difficult conversation to have, very specifically because our region is one defined by economic migrants in many ways. Earlier on, Elias Mukhosi, the Executive Secretary, had noted that the region had been able to reduce food security, or food insecurity rather, by 16%. President Ramaphosa also noting that a GDP of almost 900 billion across the region, that's $900 billion, with a population size of nearly 400 million people across the region. On the question of food security, what is it from a policy and an operational perspective that are some of the key issues that South Africa would hope to champion. I've been seeing Willie Okamp, the recently appointed Minister of Agriculture, being around here, and he's been engaging the media here on the record, off the record, informally and formally. So one would imagine his presence here means something to that conversation as well.
Well, Oliver, one of the primary causes of food insecurity in our sub-region, other than underdevelopment and infrastructural challenges, are climate-induced sort of disasters that we face as a sub-region. And one of the issues that the leaders are going to be discussing is how do we ensure resilience, but also rapid responses, as well as mitigating actions that we can take as SADC to ensure that we minimize and mitigate the impact of a climate-induced crisis on our region and its impact on food insecurity. And so it's a much broader issue than just migration. It touches on climate issues. It also touches on infrastructure, because without adequate infrastructure, you cannot move produce in and out of areas and across the sub-region. And so infrastructure is going to feature quite prominently as a catalyst that enables various economic activities to take place.
Yeah. Sophie, I want to ask Vincent about the critical minerals conversation and how that's going. But I think it's important that we frame it. Oftentimes we speak of critical minerals only as an economic conversation, but it's really a political will conversation if we take a look at the region, right? Particularly with Angola, Zambia, and the DRC, with the Lobito corridor being developed, a lot of American money being put behind that because America has an interest in critical minerals there. No country in the region can agree on what critical minerals are to each and the other, right? Last year, Minister Gwede Mantashe had published a white paper on critical minerals in South Africa. 16 plus minerals had been listed there, many of which some of us have never heard of, but seemingly are industrially important. Where can they find each other from a political will conversation, very specifically given that there are competing interests involved here, the Chinese on the one hand, the Americans on the other hand. So it is a political conversation before it's an economic one.
I have observed the tone from different leaders in the region since this topic started of how do you ensure that you use the mineral resources that we have not only in the region but on the continent to develop the continent. Because when you look at the first industrial revolution, they came, extraction, and we were left with nothing. Very few people benefited, and a particular section of the group or perhaps race benefited, but your Africans didn't benefit so much. And there's a common understanding that this time around, you have to ensure that these minerals that are found on the continent that are critical for the next industrial revolution do benefit respective countries. I'll make an example of Zimbabwe. The president of Zimbabwe, Mnangagwa, is quite strong on the issue of using the lithium, the steel that you find in Zimbabwe as part of beneficiation. When I spoke to the Foreign Affairs Minister of Zimbabwe, who went further to say they would want to partner with South Africa to ensure that you deal with these raw minerals or these minerals. You don't wait for an external world to come and extract, take everything, and you are left with nothing. And therefore, the fact that some leaders do understand that countries that are industrialized, like South Africa, can come handy on the issue of capacity and skill to help other countries to be able to use these minerals in a better way. But then the critical issue is you have to resolve the problem of electricity in the region, because when you industrialize, you need electricity to power that. But secondly, you need a lot of water to do that. Lastly, you need skills, and that is why the president was talking about how you share water in the region. And it's already happening. Lesotho assisting South Africa with the second phase of Pudihadi, the project in Lesotho. Even Botswana is going to benefit. So I think my observation, truth be told, engaging with many countries and many leaders, including the president of Botswana, he's very, very firm on this issue because of the diamonds they have there. And they want to make sure that this time around they get better value. So the question will be implementation. And I'm sorry to say, I think President Ramaphosa has a good opportunity when you talk about his legacy at the continental level and at the regional level, because we know he's leaving office 2029. This is an opportune moment with his skills of mining and leadership to ensure that we go somewhere as a region.
Yeah. Vincent, how's the conversation going on critical minerals?
Well, I think there are a couple of dimensions we need to look at. One, there is already agreement that we need to beneficiate locally.
Yeah.
That issue is no longer up for debate. What is now being looked at is what are the enablers for us to do that effectively. Electricity is one. Infrastructure more broadly is another one, as well as other elements of industrial capacity that we require. The other reality that we have to accept is that whilst we agree at a multilateral level, at a SADC level, even at an AU level, what do we do with these natural endowments that we have as a continent? That does not take away bilateral arrangements. So you will have the DRC going into a bilateral arrangement with the US. You will have a South Africa going into a bilateral arrangement with China. I'm just making an example, right?
But doesn't that work against us? Isn't there more
doesn't.
power in the collective being able to strike a single agreement rather than a litany of agreements?
We're not talking about a single endowment. We're talking about deep endowments here that are spread out throughout the region. And so, whilst countries will subscribe to a collective SADC principle, that does not take away their ability and capacity to still enter into bilateral arrangements. What you can then argue for is how do you tie some of those bilateral arrangements back into this regional integration, like we've been doing with AGOA, where inputs of goods that are produced in South Africa have come from different parts of the continent, where countries who are not necessarily signatories to AGOA have benefited by providing those inputs into South Africa. And so we already have an element of integration taking place. It needs to be accelerated, it needs to be enhanced, and we need to bring it more forcefully to what we do with critical minerals.
And just a last question that I do want you to give a response to, Vincent, and that is on not just the optics of geopolitics playing itself out here, but the real controversies surrounding it, right? The, conspicuous absence of the Tanzanian head of state, the conspicuous absence of the, Congolese head of state, with the DRC not being represented here by their head of state. And we know that President Ramaphosa has had a series of bilateral engagements over the last couple of days, some as early as this morning and some as late as last night, with various heads of state here. And of course, there's the painful question around, at least from what sources are telling us, around Eswatini on the one hand and Madagascar on the other hand, with Madagascar being represented here by a head of state that came to power through a coup. How has those things played out, and how has President Ramaphosa, as the interim chair and now the incoming chair, been managing those sensitivities?
No, I think we shouldn't read too much around the absence of a particular head of state. It happens. Even the president is not able to attend to every multilateral commitment. He will dispatch a minister, or the DP will represent him. So let's not read too much into that, number one. Number two, if you understand how SADC operates, and Sophie will know this, it's one of the most engaged organizations. We have extraordinary summits in between the summit of heads of states, and those are very narrow and specific to certain topics and issues. We have the Troika, and so SADC is a very active a grouping, in my view, that we can't judge it on the basis of attendance at a summit. Thirdly, issues that you raise around Madagascar, as you know, SADC has already endorsed a process with respect to assisting the Malagasy people resolve issues of electoral reform, resolve issues of governance. A national dialogue is going to ensue fairly soon in Madagascar, as per the briefing that the president of Madagascar gave to the president. They've already commenced with sectoral dialogues, and what they're now preparing for is a broader national dialogue that will be inclusive, as emphasized by SADC, to take the country forward. And so it's not like you have a belligerent military authority there. You have an authority that has committed itself into ushering electoral reforms, into engaging in an open and transparent national dialogue. And so those issues are being managed within the spirit of consensus and robust engagement, but more constructive in taking Madagascar forward and the entire grouping forward around those issues.
Yeah, Vincent, I know that we do have to let you go, so thank you so much for joining us here. Really do appreciate it. Vincent Magwenya, the spokesperson to President Cyril Ramaphosa. Look, a little bit later on, we'll bring your conversation that Samkele Maseko had with various other reporters with the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Ronald Lamola, and we'll, of course, some important detail comes out of those conversations that helps us make sense of the geopolitical context within which this summit is taking place in. But as Vincent Magwenya leaves us here, Sophie, I just want to perhaps throw one more question to you. Based on the answers we got from Vincent, what is it that you're expecting and hoping to hear from in terms of detail a little bit later on when we get that press briefing?
I want clarity on where to from here, because it's well and good to talk, but there must be time frames, there must be targets. And it is for that reason I feel that this is the opportunity for President Ramaphosa to ensure that targets and time frames are met in terms of the deliverables, whatever decisions have been taken. But secondly, to see who is going to chair the Troika. We know that there was an indication that Eswatini is the incoming chair of the Troika. But having spoken to some delegates from other countries, it looks like there are countries that are not in support of Eswatini chairing the Troika. But the question is, if it's not Eswatini, who? And also, there has been an announcement. Many people are expecting Eswatini to be the chair of Troika, but also to be involved in Troika, to lead the Troika. It's a lot of money, lots of meetings, as Vincent has pointed out. And therefore, is there a country that is ready, that has prepared itself to lead should Eswatini not take over? But the announcement, we've been talking about Eswatini being the incoming Troika. But you know that international global politics do have a factor at regional level, at national level, and I think some countries really are having they have reservations in terms of the United States of America sending those hard criminals in Eswatini as it relates to security. So, you know, when you are a leader, timing is very important, but also a small mistake can lead to something massive. So I think that whole concern around these criminals that are coming to different countries, being deported by the United States of America, some countries are not comfortable with that because it borders on security of neighboring countries and the continent.
Especially landlocked countries like Eswatini.
Yeah, we are not a dumping site of criminals.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have Sylvia there for now. Look, we will continue with our rolling coverage here of the 46th Ordinary Summit of the SADC Heads of State and Government. And of course, there's a lot more detail. We'll keep an eye on the detail pertaining to that press briefing that's coming up a little bit later on. But right now, as you've heard, the heads of state and government are currently engaged in those closed sessions. But for now, it's back to Auckland Park.
All right, SABC News anchor Oliver Dixon and specialist correspondent Sophie Magwenya at the 46th Summit of SADC Heads of State and Government currently underway in Durban.